Hi, today I'm going to show you the OpenAI Assistant API, what's the idea behind it and how it works in code. The Assistant API is quite a big change in the way you can interact with the OpenAI API since it introduces state. Instead of just sending user and assistant messages to the API, you can now create a thread which serves as a session for a user. You then create messages and reference the thread ID to keep track of the state. The Assistant API also allows you to use different tools: the code interpreter, retrieval, and function calling. The code interpreter allows the Assistants API to write and run Python code in a sandbox environment. Retrieval augments the assistant with knowledge from outside its model, such as product information or documents provided by the users. Function calling allows you to describe functions to the assistant and have it intelligently return the functions that need to be called along with the arguments. Now let's jump into the code to use the API ourselves. Okay, I'm now in VS Code and now we can work with the code. You can also get the code in the description and code along with me. So to make this work, we need an OpenAI API key, which is in a .env file, and we use python.env to load that .env variables. And now we got our API key in the environment variables and we can instantiate our OpenAI client. So that's quite important, otherwise it will not work. The next step is to create two functions. So this makes a request to HTTP localhost 8000 to the endpoint opening hours. So this is a little fake API which is created in this main.py. So this just will return that the bank is currently closed, but I want to show you how you can use function calling to make a request to an API. And then we use a second function for function calling, which is just the howlate function, and it only returns the current time. We now use the OpenAI client the first time to create a file. This file is part of our knowledge base we use for retrieval. So we use the create method of our client. Then we open our file. So this is the knowledge.txt file, which contains some information about a fictional bank, and this will be used for retrieval. So we have to set a purpose, and the purpose is assistance. So this refers to the Assistants API. Now we've got this file variable and we want to use it later here in the code. Okay, the next step is to create an assistant. So inside our instance, we've got a better attribute, which has got another assistance attribute, which has got a create method, and we have to provide that create method a name, a description, and a model. So I will use GPT-4 Turbo to do this. And very important here, we have to provide the tools we want to use. So I will use all the available tools. So we will use the interpreter. So you have to do it like this: provide a dictionary with type and then code interpreter. The next is type and then retrieval. And after that, we have to create another dictionary. And here we have to describe our functions. So we can describe multiple functions like this. So we provide type equals function, or set this as key, and this is the value of the key. And now inside here, we have to describe our function. So the name of the function is get opening hours. This is the same as here, so this has to match. And then we have to provide a description. This is important for the OpenAI API to know what and when to call it. And after that, we have to provide some parameters. So what parameters is this function called with? So in our case, we don't have any parameters in our function. We then do the same for our second function. So again, type function, and the function has got a name, which is howlate, and the description get the current time. Since we use retrieval, we also have to provide file IDs, and the file IDs are just a list of file objects, and the file object has got an ID attribute, and this is what we have to provide here for our assistant. So let's run the code. And we also want to print our assistant. We can see that our assistant has got an ID, a creation timestamp, a description, everything we provided in that large object. So before we can use it, we first have to create a thread. So this thread keeps track of our state. So all conversations are related to one thread, and this is what we create here. So we use this thread through the whole process. So now we create our first message. So instead of the normal OpenAI API where you pass a list of messages which only contain role and content, in this case we also pass in a thread ID. And this is the ID attribute of the thread object we created here. So always link these objects together by their ID. We now create our first message, and now we can use that message to pass it to our assistant. Okay, now we want to bring it all together, and we've got our thread and we've got our assistant. So the next step is to create a so-called run, and the create method of that run object creates the process to launch our thread. So this is why we pass in the thread ID, and we also pass in the assistant, which has got all of our tools. We could potentially also override the tools here, but you don't have to do this since we provided all of the tools in the initial instantiation process of our assistant. So what we also have to provide here are the instructions. So please address the user as Jane Doe, and the user has got a premium account. So this is like the system message in the normal OpenAI API. So now we create our run, and we now in the next step want to retrieve the current state of that run. So this has got a status attribute, and if we want to retrieve it, we can see that this is in progress. So we could click on here again and again, but the better step is to do so-called polling. So I created a little function where you pass in a client, a thread ID, and also the run ID. And we want to retrieve that run ID and print the status. So this is what this function does. So we don't have to click again and again. And now we can see what is the result here. So run has finished or requires action. And yeah, the current status is now finished. We can also see it here again. If we do this, we can see that this run is now over or completed. We can also get a lot more information about our run. So if we print this, we can see that we've got a run ID, we've got the assistant ID, cancelled, completed. So this is the state of our run. It is not expired, it did not fail, and it also contained some file IDs. Yeah, not too much information we need here, but if you want to have a deep dive, then you can analyze this object. So what we have to do is we want to extract now the messages from our thread. So this can be done with the list method, and the actual data is saved in this data attribute. So if we run that code, we can now see that we've got also a complex object, which has got an ID, also the assistant, and so on and so on. But we actually want the result of our response. So we can iterate over this, since this is a list. And here inside we've got a content attribute, and this content attribute is actually a list, and we want to extract the text from this. So if we run this, we can now see this is the result, and we can see that our assistant retrieved that information from our knowledge.txt. Okay, in the next part of the notebook, we will concentrate on function calling, since many people seem to struggle with that in the Assistant API. So first we're going to create a new message again, where we pass in our thread ID and also role user, and now we ask how late is it. So this will require a function call. So let's create that message, and now we want to run or create a run again. So after creating the run, let's check the status of that run. So currently, if we check that, it is queued. To change that, we have to call the retrieve method, and this will now give us back the information. If we take that again, we can see now we've got requires action, and this is always the case if we have to perform OpenAI function calling to answer a question. We now of course want to know what exactly we have to do, and to find that out we have to access the required action attribute, which has got another attribute, submit tools output, and this has got the tool calls attribute. So if we have a look at that, we can see that here we've got the list, and here we can see what functions we have to call and what arguments we have to call it. So this is the name of the function we want to call, and these are the arguments. So we don't have any arguments for that function, and now we have to work with that. So as we can see, this is a list, so we can loop over that list, and we can retrieve the ID of that tool call. So that's the ID, and we also can extract the name. So here this is the name attribute of that function attribute, so we can access it like this. So this is our function name we want to execute. So now we can check if the function name is get opening hours, we will execute that and save the output in the output variable. Otherwise we want to call the how late function and also save that in the output variable. Otherwise the output will be function not recognized, so this will be a soft error. And with that output, we now want to feed that output to another function called submit tools output. The submit tools output method expects a thread ID, a run ID, and also this tools output parameter, which is a list. And here we pass in a dictionary, here tool call ID. So this is the only tool we call. So this is our ID from that iteration. And here we pass in the output itself. So this is the output of the howLate function, which will be the current time. So let's now execute that. And here we can see execute function is howLate. So this was printed here. That's the function name we want to execute. And we can also see this is the time I executed that code. The next step is to run again the retrieve method with a thread ID and the run ID. So we update that. And then we also want to get our messages again. So we run the list method with our thread ID. And now we can check the data attribute, loop over it, and we can see how much does a loan cost. So this is the first answer. How late is it? So this is the answer from the second question. Yeah, that's it. So this is how you make the whole process of calling the OpenAI API stateful. And it also gives you a lot of power in combination with retrieval and also the code interpreter. So one last but very important step, and that is to delete your assistant and also your files, because you will be billed daily for existing files on your system or on the OpenAI system. To do this, just run the delete method and pass in the assistant ID and also the file ID, and then your assistant and the files will be deleted. If you run it again, we can see that we've got a not found error, which is fine. So our resources were deleted and you won't be billed for anything. Okay, that's it. Thank you for watching. See you. Bye bye.